You're listening to the podcast for all of the news, notes, and breakdowns for your Ohio State Buckeyes. This is Sons of the Shoe with Nick Wilson and Spencer German.
Sons of the Shoe returns. Spencer German with you. Nick Wilson had something come up, so he unfortunately won't be joining us this week. But the countdown to the regular season continues. Very, very excited for the return of college football in a couple weeks, which is crazy to think that it really is just a couple weeks away. I do want to remind you guys, as always, that we remain a relatively new, still under a year-old podcast. So please like, follow, subscribe, comment at the 92 Through the Fan YouTube channel in the comments section. Let us know your thoughts on anything that we talk about today. And I'm very excited this week. Not that I'm not always excited to do this show and connect with you Buckeyes fans, but I'm very excited this week because we have a guest, and it is a guest who covers one of the newest members of the Big Ten. We are talking about and happy to welcome into the show Alec Dietz, who covers the Oregon Ducks for the Eugene Register Guard, part of the USA Today branch of newspapers. Alec, can't thank you enough, man. I know we took a couple weeks here to finally get you pinned down with the the opposite sides of the country thing got a little bit complicated, but you know what? It's kind of a microcosm of life in the Big Ten these days. It's a lot of cross country flights and traveling.
Yeah, and just the coast to coast stuff. That's definitely something we're getting used to. I know for media days, I was covering it from here. I didn't get to go to Indy, but I had to wake up and watch it 8 o'clock in the morning. So, it's all a part of it now.
Well, actually, I feel like that's a good place to start, honestly, because I know generally, here in Ohio and I think throughout the Big Ten being sort of a Midwest conference, right, to start out, the roots of it, I kind of get a sense of how the Big Ten fans feel about this conference realignment thing. And I think most people feel like it's a good thing. And the fact that the SEC and the Big Ten kind of followed suit and emerged as this other power conference is a good thing. But I am curious, what has the reaction been out west in Eugene and other teams that used to be part of the Pac-12 that now is down to 2 teams? Like, how are they taking the, just completely the realignment that brings some of these other programs into the Big Ten and kind of eliminates the Pac-12 off the board?
Yeah, I think, just from Oregon's standpoint and Dan Lanning and the leadership there, joining the Big Ten was a lot of a relief because it gave them a future that wasn't so murky, right? With all the media rights stuff that was happening with the Pac-12, are you going to be on Apple TV? Or are you even going to find your way on national TV? Joining the Big Ten was like, okay, our future is set. We have the media rights all in place. We don't have to worry about all that stuff. So I know that was sort of a sigh of relief to just get that all sort of figured out. I know there's a lot of fans that were sort of upset about the Pac-12 going away. I mean, it's over 100-year-old conference and has a lot of history. Oregon's been in it since it was the Pac-4. So, it has survived multiple iterations of the Pacific Conference. And, so a lot are upset to see that go. And obviously, if you're Oregon State and Washington State, you're definitely upset that you got left behind. But I do think there's a lot of excitement about, joining a conference like the Big Ten, having that steady future, and also being in a conference that now spans 3 time zones.
Yeah. And I don't know if you guys have seen yet the famous Big Ten commercial. Yeah. We love that commercial in the Big. All the Big Ten schools love that commercial, and it aired, I think, for like the first time I saw last week. And to see Oregon pop up and Washington pop up and USC pop up, all was right in the world that they brought that commercial back. I was very happy with that.
Right, yeah, and it starts in the Pacific Northwest up there too. So yeah.
It is crazy how the Big Ten certainly spans coast to coast, and obviously I don't think realignment's done either. There's certainly going to be more to come in future years. I think Notre Dame at some point makes sense if they can get off of the fact that they're independent and give up that NBC deal that they have. But yeah, it's crazy times in college football. I do want to ask, as we just talk more specifically about Oregon joining the Big Ten and what it means and different matchups and things. We'll get into Ohio State versus Oregon, but I do want to know from your perspective, do you think, because we talk a lot about Big Ten football and it's kind of this gritty, the best way to sum it up actually is how Michigan won the national championship last year. is kind of the definition of Big Ten football. They do it in the trenches. It's kind of tough-nosed. And we talk a lot about how Ohio State has kind of become this more finesse team that can beat SEC teams, right? Because that's what their goal is. And that's kind of allowed them to take a step back when it comes to beating Michigan, which is why they've struggled against them of late, because Big Ten or Michigan was built to win the Big Ten. So with that in mind, do you think Oregon will have to adjust more to winning in the Big Ten, or the Big Ten will have to adjust more to Oregon's style of play?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the ultimate question that we won't really know until we see it this fall. But I think it's probably going to be a little bit of both. In the Pac-12, there were really only two teams in probably Oregon State and Utah that sort of play that sort of physical. We're going to win with defense, winning the turnover battle, running it right down your throat, like Michigan showed in the national championship. And obviously, a whole lot more Big Ten teams do that. It's not just Michigan, right? At the Iowas and the Northwesterns, all those teams. So it's going to be interesting to see how week to week Oregon can sort of deal with that new style of play every single week, where obviously offenses were a lot more wide open in the Pac-12. But I also think that, there is definitely going to be an adjustment to Oregon on the schedule. They spread you out. They are going to lead college football and a lot of offensive statistics like they did last season. And also they're very fast on defense and plenty physical too. Dan Lanning's been trying to build this team to sort of look like a SEC team out West for years, regardless of whether they were going to join the Big Ten or not. So I think it's going to be a bit of both, and it's going to be sort of fascinating to see what it looks like for all the teams out West against the Big Ten teams week to week.
Yeah, Oregon doesn't yet know what it's like to trot into Kinnick Stadium in Iowa and have to play in front of that raucous crowd and, struggle to score 17 points and try to win. They don't know that yet. That's a tough game every time.
It is. Well, they have to go to Madison in late or mid-November. And I mean, it's going to be cold. It's going to be a different level of cold than they're used to. So that's not to say they can't do it. But it's just going to be interesting to see sort of all the new experiences that they're going to have as a program this year.
Yeah, that'd be a lot of fun to watch unfold, and obviously to cover on your end of things. You talk about the style of play that Oregon has, similar to Ohio State, in that they try to build themselves to beat SEC teams while also trying to navigate the conference schedule. And I think that's interesting because, listen. Ohio State, Michigan is always going to be Ohio State, Michigan. It's one of the biggest rivalries, if not the biggest rivalry in college football. But I've kind of been saying now on this show for a couple weeks now that I am already seeing like the early stages of Oregon and Ohio State becoming almost like this secondary rivalry for Ohio State. Do you see that too? And do you think that that's something that maybe is Oregon fans and people who are around that program kind of seeing it the same way, where that could become like, it's 1A is Ohio State, Michigan, and 1B could be Oregon, Ohio State?
Yeah, I think that, anytime two teams are really competitive in a conference, I think there's going to be sort of a rivalry, at least with fans preseason now with social media. Stanford and Oregon in the 2010s weren't like natural rivals, but became big rivals every single year because they were the two teams competing in the Pac-12 year in, year out. For the most part, but that was back when the Pac-12 was split between North and South, and the Oregon and Stanford were in the same division. And most of the time, whoever won that matchup would go on to, beat up on the Pac-12 South champ. So I think that just because these two teams are both vying for a national championship, they're not mincing words about what their goals are this season, and they know that they have to get through the other one to accomplish that goal at some point, whether it's October 12th at Autzen or in the Big Ten championship or in the playoff. I think that, those sort of rivalries just sort of form just because they're two teams competing for the same thing at the highest level.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting too, kind of what you alluded to, is we know they play in the regular season in October, but there's a chance now because of the expanded playoff, because the Big Ten change, they don't have the divisions anymore. It's basically just like the two best teams. They could play each other maybe 2 times, maybe even 3 times if things fall right in terms of the playoff. And I think that adds to the lure of this could really become something in year one of them being in the same conference. It could already be we hate them because they beat us twice and stopped us from winning a championship, or vice versa.
Right. And I just think, Oregon is sort of the new kids on the block, right? I don't think
Yeah.
many teams in their first season in a new conference have won the conference or run the table and won every single game, right? So it sort of puts a target on your back already, and the fact that Oregon's getting all this hype, right? All these teams are seeing, oh, this team from the Pac-12 is coming in and getting first place votes to win the conference. Their quarterback is the Heisman Trophy favorite, so they've already sort of got a target on their back, and Oregon's not shying away from it either. They want to come in and win it year one. And they've made it clear that they want to compete for a national championship. They're not easing their way into this transition. So, yeah, I think it's just it's fascinating in that regard. Plus, I think both Ohio State and Oregon have both sort of maybe underachieved. Underachieved isn't the right word, but they haven't gotten over the hump and competed where they wanted to compete in recent years, since they both played in the national championship in 2014. Really.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say you can say underachieved because you'll learn really quickly, Alec. Like Ohio State fans, I mean, I think every college fan base to an extent is a bit of a cult, but like, I mean, there's people saying already like Ryan Day's job is on the line this year, which is every year now. But it's like, listen, like Oregon is the game they've circled because how he performs against that game or in that game, how the team performs in that game. They're watching very closely to kind of decide what Ryan Day's future is going to look like. And so, yeah, I think underperformed is a good word for it, because anytime in this part of the country, like if they don't beat Michigan, that's considered underperforming. So I think that's actually a good word for it.
Yeah. Well, and again, both those teams haven't been able to get over that hump to beat their rivals and get into that national championship. And for Oregon, they haven't even been to the playoffs. So, that October 12th game is going to be obviously the first one, if there is any more afterwards, but it's going to be a good litmus test for both teams that sort of have a reputation for not being able to get over the hump and win that game against a conference rival that really means a lot. So, yeah.
You mentioned the quarterback position for Oregon. I sort of another comparison between Oregon and Ohio State. They both have transfer quarterbacks coming in who are, starting with their team for the first time, trying to sort of prove something and have stacked rosters around them. So along those lines, just what has the transition been like as Dylan Gabriel comes in from Oklahoma? What have you kind of seen from him, and what are you expecting his 2024 season to look like?
Yeah, I think that, for the most part, when you welcome in a quarterback that's thrown 125 career touchdowns, who has 15,000 career passing yards, you got a guy that obviously has a lot of experience. I mean, almost 4 full seasons. I think he does have 4 full seasons of starting, a couple at UCF, now a couple at Oklahoma. So he's sort of been coast to coast, you could say, with the Big Ten with his playing career. So you bring in a guy that has seen it all, has been through it all as a college quarterback. And when he saw what Bo Nix did last season, and the numbers he was able to put up, you had a 1,000-yard rusher last year, you had 2 1,000-yard receivers. He's joining a proven concept of an offense that can put up numbers, that can do things. So I'd anticipate a pretty similar season to what Bo Nix did, just given the proven concept that's already there, and all the talent around him. Because obviously it starts with him. He was one of their first transfer portal commits. They wanted to go get their quarterback to say, hey, we've got a guy. Now you want to come play with him. And then it all became about building around him. So he's set up for all the same success that Bo Nix had in each of his 2 years at Oregon after he transferred from Auburn.
Another sort of parallel between Ohio State and Oregon is just like the offensive skill positions that both these teams have. And, there's a case to be made for, I think, either of these teams' wide receiver groups being the best in the country. I guess, where do you think Oregon stacks up with that when you got like Tez Johnson, who's back from transferring in last year? Evan Stewart just transferred in this year. Like that group is stacked, and they have a little bit more, I think, experience than the Ohio State group, but also here in Ohio State, or here in Ohio, people are really excited about the true freshman Jeremiah Smith, who's supposed to really break out and have a good season too.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of excitement, because anytime you lose your single season receiving leader in Troy Franklin last year, but you still return 60% of your yards from your receivers last season, you return your top 2 tight ends, and you bring in a guy like Evan Stewart, who just has all this untapped potential that he never really hit. at Texas A&M. There's a lot of excitement about that room and what they're able to do. And you've got a proven guy in Tez Johnson, who again had 1,000 yards last season after transferring. You have a Trayshawn Holden, who transferred in from Alabama and had almost 500 yards. Gary Bryant, who was at USC, who had almost 500 yards. And then not to mention not too shabby recruiting class too of guys that may not even play this year, but Jeremiah McClellan, Jack Wrestler, a lot of highly touted guys that may not even see the field. So I think there's a lot of excitement about the depth in that room. And, they've already been talking about, how you have to kind of share the ball between a whole bunch of guys that are weapons in the offense. And it's really an embarrassment. And Ohio State, I think, is in a similar position with Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Ibuka and all those guys being they have a couple guys that are sort of proven, that have been there and shown it, and then a couple guys in the wings where you're like, hey, if this guy can come in and contribute right away, it's really going to put them over the top.
Yeah, I mean, the theme of this conversation, I think, remains like it's an arms race between those two teams, man. Yeah. Like it's going to be fun to watch this year, but also in future years. They're competing with each other for a lot of the same recruits and stuff too. So it's fascinating. Anything else that I guess us here in Ohio or other Big Ten fans or Ohio State fans in general should know about Oregon that makes them a threat in the Big Ten this year?
I think that Oregon's not really getting enough credit nationally. Obviously, the offense is easy and it's flashy, and you already saw it last year with what Bo Nix was able to do. And you go get Evan Stewart, who's obviously been really visible, but their defense was a top 10 unit for a lot of last year in stopping the run, and really just had a couple bad games against Washington, which everyone did except for Michigan in the national championship against that passing offense. So, and the amount of talent that they've added in that defensive backfield was really an emphasis. They added 4 guys who have 1 year of eligibility left, who are multiple year starters. They go get Jabbar Muhammad from Washington. They get Kobe Savage from Kansas State, who's a multi-year starter. Cam Alexander from a smaller college in UTSA, but still 1 year of eligibility left. So they had a clear plan of going to get guys that had playing experience at the Division I level or at their Power 5 level at the big stage, and are developing guys sort of underneath that. But they really sent a message that they're competing this year by going after so many guys with just 1 year left, right? Because they need to maximize that last season. They're not getting a guy that was a freshman and didn't get a lot of playing time and maybe has some upside but is unproven. They got a bunch of proven guy on the defensive line. They go get Derek Harmon from Michigan State and Jamari Caldwell from Houston. So I think that defense is sort of being overlooked right now. But again, it would be interesting to see how it plays out once the season rolls around.
I just kind of thought of this one on the fly here, but earlier this offseason, I know Ohio State lost their running backs coach, Tony Alford, to Michigan. And then that meant they went out and hired Carlos Loughlin from Oregon. What was the reaction to that, and how was he regarded within that program before he obviously left for Ohio State?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was definitely well regarded in the running back room. Anytime you talk to those running backs, they had good things to say about him. I think when he left, it was right in the middle of spring ball, so it was a little awkward timing. And you talked to Dan Lanning, I think the day after, and they were sort of already on, okay, we're moving on mode, right? We're moving on to who wants to be here and finding a replacement coach and all those other sorts of things. So you look at that connection, and you obviously look at Chip Kelly, who obviously made a name for himself at Oregon years and years ago. So there are a lot of connections in that game as well, just from a personal level. So it's going to be a fascinating game. I have zero doubts it'll be game of the week, and there'll be plenty of talk all week about the result of that game. So I'm looking forward to it already. Selfishly, I think as a journalist, you try not to be like circling the games midway through the year, but that one's going to be big. And obviously Oregon fans are also excited about that game being played at Autzen, because the game 4 years ago during the COVID season that was supposed to happen there for the home and home didn't happen.
That's right.
It's going to be cool for a lot. I think the tickets are already going for a lot of money. So it's especially since Oregon Stadium is just a little bit smaller. It only holds about 60,000. So it's gonna be a big game.
I'll get you out of here with this kind of a fun one. And this is more of an overarching news story from college football this week, where you had Pitbull buy the naming rights to, I don't know if you saw this, FIU's stadium. And he pays like, he's paying like 1.2 million over 5 years, or whatever it is. And he gets all these special benefits from the stadium to be at games, perform, and all that. So my question for you is, what's the artist that you would want to be if Oregon sold the naming rights to Autzen Stadium to anybody? What artist comes to mind as like, that's the name, that's the person that I want associated with Oregon Stadium?
Oh man, that's a tough question.
I put you on the spot. I know.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything off the top of my head.
See, because I try to think of for Ohio, we have so many like great artists that have come out of Ohio, and like one that comes to mind is like the Black Keys, right? Like they're from Cleveland.
Yeah.
Like, I try to think of like artists from that area. I don't know off the top of my head like any artists from Oregon or like who's big that would maybe work. But that's why I was asking you the question.
Yeah, I think they play a song in the stadium by a local artist named Matt Kearney or Kearney. He's a country artist.
Okay.
And he's from town. He's not huge, but he's pretty well known. I'd imagine he performed a concert, I think, after the spring game at Autzen this past spring. So it'd probably have to be him. But that's a tough question. That's a tough question. And yeah, that's wild. I think like that was like the Jimmy Kimmel Bowl too, where he was like,
that's right,
running around during that whole bowl game doing whatever he wanted because he paid for the rights for it. So yeah, these sponsorships are interesting now.
He's Alec Dietz. He covers Oregon for the Register Guard the Eugene Register Guard, out in Eugene, Oregon. You can follow him on X. Super easy. It's literally just his name, Alec Dietz, to follow along, because, guys, Oregon's in the Big Ten now. So you got to stay in tune with what's going on with that team. And Alec's a great person to follow in that regard, because he's going to have you covered with everything all season long. Alec, I can't thank you enough for joining us this week. Let me say this now. Leading up to that game on October 12th, let's try to do this again and get you on for the sort of a preview episode of that game, because I thought this conversation was awesome. And as we already kind of hinted at, there's so many connections between these two teams.
Yeah,
it's going to make that matchup so fun. So we'll have a lot to talk about. But let's just kind of map that out now. As we'll pencil it in as something that we're going to try to do this season. So
for sure, we might need like a month to get it locked in, given how this one went. But
October 12th really isn't that far from now, so you'll be hearing from me in like 2 weeks. Like I'll just say, hey, I'm just reminding you. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, sure. I can't thank you enough, man. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, guys, we'll be back on the other side of a quick break. We'll react to everything Alec had to say about Oregon. Also, everything going on with the Michigan program right now. Jim Harbaugh getting suspensions when he's in the NFL. How is that going to work? We'll talk about all that and more. But first, here is a quick word from our sponsors. Welcome back in. Sons of the Shoe. Spencer German with you. Riding solo once again this week. But I wasn't solo for that first segment, and I thought it was awesome. Again, Alec Dietz, who, again, covers Oregon for the Eugene Register Guard, and I thought he was awesome. Like, getting into just all the nitty-gritty details of Oregon coming into the Big Ten. I think he was being, like, honest about – I loved the question I asked about, not to, like, toot my own horn here, about my amazing Howard Stern-like questioning, but I loved my question about just is the Big Ten in for a bigger adjustment against Oregon, or Oregon in a bigger adjustment for the Big Ten? I think that is truly like one of the big stories about this whole realignment thing, because as much as you look at it and you say, Oregon coaches poll came out this week, they're number 3, right? And you think, okay, they're going to roll their way through the Big Ten. It's going to be easy. These Big Ten teams surprise even some of the better Big Ten teams, right? Like we brought up Iowa in that conversation in Kinnick Stadium and how that can be a tough place to play. And, Alec brought up like they got to play in Madison at some point this year. Like you roll into some of these stadiums and it can it can be a scare. Like, you just never know what's going to happen. And it's a different environment. It's a different style of football in some ways. And I do think, like, he emphasized that Oregon's defense isn't maybe as bad or isn't getting enough credit for being better. And I think a lot of that is like the blanket statements made about the Pac-12, right? We've spent so many years dogging on the Pac-12 because they don't play defense, or they don't have as good of defenses out there. The Big 12 is the one that really plays no defense. Pac-12 was kind of like a close second, where it was like a lot of high octane offenses, and the defenses, depending on who you were playing, were hit or miss. But like, think about like Utah, they're scoring all these points. USC had a terrible defense last year, despite having Caleb Williams on offense and the best quarterback in football, arguably. So like, that's always been a bugaboo for them. But he was saying Oregon's defense is better than they're getting credit for. So that's good from Oregon's standpoint. But again, you go in and you get pushed around by a more physical Wisconsin team or a more physical Iowa team or whatever, and you just never know. So I do think it's going to be an adjustment both ways. But what's interesting too is, like, because Ohio State is a similar team to Oregon, it's almost like I think about Oregon losing games to some teams that normally you wouldn't think they would, and that Ohio State is actually a more advantageous matchup to them. And because they're going to be very similar. Now, Ohio State's defense might be better, but because of how just star-studded they are, and the secondary calling themselves best in America with the guys that they have, and Burke and obviously Caleb Downs joining the fold as a transfer, and others. So there's always the possibility that is true, but like, I think it is going to be a little bit of a wake-up call for that side of the ball, specifically for Oregon. And I don't think it's just going to be this cakewalk, even if they go out to beat Ohio State, because I do think Ohio State, they'll be a better matchup for them because they play similar styles, and that's more what they're used to. So we know in sports, man, like, sometimes you might be the best team, or you might have the best team, and that doesn't always matter when push comes to shove, because sometimes it's about matchups. And if you get the right matchup on a certain day, sometimes that allows you to win, even if you lose to other teams. But yeah, watching that unfold is going to be fascinating. The Dylan Gabriel stuff was fascinating, just how he's, in the mix or the top option in Vegas for the Heisman. And he's got so much talent around him, so it makes a lot of sense. And conversely, Ohio State has a transfer quarterback of their own that they're trying to sort of build this offense around. So I think that's going to be interesting. And, something that will obviously follow throughout the season. And then I do think too that you have, I love that he gave credence to what I've been saying for several weeks now about this potential matchup. And it's funny, I said it during the conversation, but as we got more and more into it, it was like you just kept finding more and more parallels between Ohio State and Oregon. Whether it's Carlos Loughlin joining Ohio State staff after he was on Oregon staff, whether it's the fact that they play similar styles, they both have very high octane offenses, really good receivers, and they're going to score a lot of points on you. They both have transfer quarterbacks who are coming in from different schools more out west or in the Midwest. Like, the similarities are endless. And that, I think, just adds to the intrigue of these two teams when they get to meet on October 12th in Eugene at Autzen Stadium, with a chance to really see how it all kind of transpires in the football field. And then you throw in, like I mentioned, chance to see them maybe 2, if not 3 times in a season, or those two teams to meet 2 or 3 times in the season. That's pretty damn remarkable. And I'm telling you, if that happens, if they see each other twice, like Big Ten championship game plus the regular season matchup, or even, and take a step further, if they see each other 3 times, you could end this season feeling like it already is like a huge rivalry in the Big Ten. And that's what's exciting about the implications of expansion. You get some new different matchups. And I understand tradition matters to fan bases in this sport. And so, yeah, you're losing Oregon State. And you lose some of these teams that you've been more associated with over the years because you're not in the Pac-12 anymore. And that does stink. Like, I feel sorry for some of those fan bases that their teams aren't joining some of these 2 mega conferences, or that they've kind of gotten left behind, and just what that all means for the future and rivalries and all these different things. I do feel for those fan bases. But in terms of like the Big Ten, you're going to get some new rivalries out of this. You're going to get some really good matchups out of this. You're going to get some fun, just, I think, games in general with great storylines and great theater. on the football field that we can all enjoy. So I'm looking forward to all that. And like I said, if you get to the end of the season and Ohio State, Oregon somehow, some way meet 3 times in a season, 3 times, we'll be sitting here saying like, yeah, that's a rivalry, especially if like they split a little bit. Like if it's like maybe Oregon wins in the regular season, Ohio State wins, then Oregon wins again, or vice versa. I know if that happened, I think it would be a doomsday scenario where we'd be asking, or a lot of people would be saying Ryan Day should be fired. But it's, I mean, he's getting asked to be fired, or he's being urged to be fired for less. So wouldn't be that bad in the grand scheme of things, because people want him fired if he looks the wrong way at a fan. Like, I don't know, if he breathes funny. But regardless, I digress. Yeah, like this Oregon Ohio State thing could really snowball into something bigger. Like, we're just talking about it now, but by the end of the season, it could be already something that we're talking about as like the next big matchup, or the second biggest matchup for them every single year in this conference. So a lot of fun stuff. I'm glad that Alex was able to join us, and I look forward to getting him back on in the lead up to that game, sort of previewing things coming up to October 12th. And I'm sure Nick will be on with us then, and he'll be able to ask some questions and do some fun things with him. So I'm very, very much looking forward to doing that with Nick and having Alec back at some point. I do want to pivot and give some time to the big story this week from the NCAA and college football, other than the coaches poll coming out and the Pitbull story, which I will get to. I will get to the Pitbull thing coming up here in a little bit. But we'll do that in 4 Down territory, by the way. But I want to get to this because we talk about parallels between two programs, and it is kind of interesting that all of a sudden Michigan finds itself in a very similar situation, or more specifically, Jim Harbaugh finds itself in a very similar situation to what Jim Tressel found himself in 2011 for the Terrell Pryor selling of obviously the improper benefits is what they called it, but the fact that they were selling merchandise, selling apparel and all that different stuff, selling their gold pants and all that, and they got in trouble for it. And Terrell Pryor obviously got suspended, and Jim Tressel was given at that time a 4-year show cause from the NCAA, which basically means, okay, in order for a team to hire him, they have to show cause as to why they're hiring him. And then he would have had to serve a 6-game suspension if he returned to college football. And so at that time, and this is where it gets really interesting, at that time, he went to the NFL to be a consultant with the Colts that next year. And Roger Goodell stood by the NCAA's ruling and said, okay, he's going to be suspended 6 games. He had to serve that 6-game suspension in the NFL. And there's all these connections between, well, the obvious things are like the college football is basically like a free farm system for the NFL. So I think in the past, they have really leaned into like, okay, if you do something, if you say something, we are going to enforce it because we want this partnership to be strong and continue and whatever. You're not getting that, it seems like, with the Jim Harbaugh situation right now, because Jim Tressel received a 5-year show cause. Jim Harbaugh received a 4-year show cause this time around. And again, this is his punishment for not for the Connor Stallion sign stealing. This is for the recruiting violations during COVID, where he got the cheeseburgers with the players and then lied about it. And that's the thing people have to remember here, because I understand this falls in line with what we said about some of the Connor Stallion stuff, like everyone's stealing signs, whatever. It's not as big of a deal as maybe we've made it. This truly isn't that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. But the problem is that Jim Harbaugh lied, and he's been reportedly not really cooperative with the NCAA in these investigations. And when he was caught in the situation breaking these rules, he lied about it and said he didn't do it. That's the thing that's getting him in trouble now, because he lied about it. I think if he had been up front, the punishment probably wouldn't be this severe. And so we can go into whether or not we think the NCAA is just a sham, weak, timid organization anyway that really doesn't have any power behind it, and whether or not any of this actually matters. But what's interesting about that is 13 years after the fact, 13 years after Jim Tressel's situation, which again, very, very similar. He leaves to the NFL, and the NFL upheld that suspension. It doesn't sound like the NFL is going to do the same thing with Jim Harbaugh. They were asked about it and basically declined to comment on if there's a precedent set for him this year and this time around. College football's changed since then. And I think that's the biggest thing to keep in mind here is like back then, I think the NFL probably looked and said, we want to have a good relationship with the NCAA. Now you have conference realignment. Now you have NIL. Now you have all these different things happening. It sounds like there's at some point going to be the shift to, well, we want just an overarching body to be like the conferences and everything else will sort of fall in line from there. And then the NCAA can oversee all the other sports, right? Like football is going to be its own entity with its own governing body, sort of ran by the commissioners of these conferences or whatever, of these super conferences or whatever. And it's going to be different. The NCAA has clearly lost power over the last decade plus to the point where it doesn't even seem like the NFL like respects their gravitas or the power that they supposedly have. And so I don't think Jim Harbaugh is going to get suspended in the NFL. And it's just funny how the situations being similar, they're being handled completely differently, like a little over 10 years apart. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. Was there a precedent set? Yeah, it sure seems that way. But things have changed since then. And I don't think, like, I'm going to be honest, like, I think it seems stupid that he could get suspended in the NFL. Like, what jurisdiction does the NCAA have in the NFL other than the fact that they are basically a free farm system for the NFL? That's it. But if like they're not like linked in terms of like the organizations like you see in like baseball or something like that. So I don't know how that should. To me, it doesn't matter that Jim Harbaugh sought refuge. And to be clear, like I think Jim Tressel should have been off the hook too when he sought refuge in the NFL. I think that's all stupid. But it seems ludicrous that they'd actually follow through with this. And I don't think they will, especially because Jim Harbaugh is a polarizing figure in the NFL right now as one of the more outspoken and sort of fun coaches who says things that get aggregated on social media. And so I don't know that it's really something that is going to carry much weight or carry much water. So it's a fascinating parallel. It is between the Harbaugh and the Tressel situations. And I understand why Ohio State fans are like, well, he should be suspended too in the NFL like Jim Tressel was. But I just think because how much college football has changed and because the NCAA has lost significantly more and more power over the years, I don't know that it's going to have the same result that one did. And I think we just kind of have to live with that, even if it's quote unquote unfair. But yeah, it's fascinating that these, over a decade apart, we're seeing a very similar situation kind of play out with the two biggest rivals in college football and their coaches. Now, the other part I want to get to with Michigan, and we'll sort of wrap this up to get out of this segment and lead you into, obviously, 4 down territory to get us out of here. Got 4 fun topics for you that we'll get to. But the other part of this is the actual side of the actual Connor Stalions sign stealing scandal news that we got last weekend, sort of into start this week. And that'll centered around the fact that Sharon Moore was caught having texted Connor Stalions and then subsequently deleting those texts on the day that reports came out that they were being investigated for this operation that they were conducting. Now, here's what I'm going to say about this. And I said this in our mini-sode that I dropped earlier this week. It was a short, like 5-minute mini-sode. You can find it, Sons of the Shoe, wherever you get your podcast, Spotify, Odyssey app, Apple Podcasts again, Spotify, but also Apple Podcasts. You can find it there. And at the 92 The Fan YouTube. Well, actually, I take that back. The mini-sode is not on the 92 The Fan YouTube channel, so don't go looking for it there. I digress, though. I'll sum it up by saying this. If you delete texts, you're guilty of something, okay? And the example that I used was like, if you are texting another woman and you're married, and even if your wife doesn't know, you're doing it behind her back, and you feel like you need to delete those texts to make sure she doesn't see them or find out you're doing something wrong, you're guilty. You're guilty. And that's how I feel about Sharon Moore. He was doing something shady, tried to delete it, And because you tried to delete it, you're telling on yourself, you're guilty. And if there's one thing I agree with in terms of punishment that the NCAA can hand out for this specific thing, if it means Sherrone Moore getting suspended, I think that's fine. Because the adults in the room are the ones who are obviously overseeing all this. And they're the ones that have to, I think, answer for the crimes of what was going on, not the players. Like the bull ban stuff is stupid to me. You're punishing the wrong people when you do that. I think you have to punish the coaches and the powers, the people that were in power within the organization. Now, in theory, that would mean Jim Harbaugh because it's his program, and he says he doesn't know what was going on. Fine, whatever. And he's now sought refuge in the NFL, and I think that's also fine. So he got out while he could, and that is what it is. But I do think, if he was back this year, I would say the same thing about him. If you're finding all these details, it was his program. He probably deserves to get suspended again. And I think the same thing should be said about Sherrone Moore here, where if you're going to punish anybody, punish him. If he's the one, if he was part of it, if he was texting about it, if there was stuff that he thought he needed to hide, so he deleted his text messages, he probably deserves to get suspended in some capacity. Now, there's nothing given to him yet. There's still details that are being uncovered. But, Sherrone Moore, you're guilty. And you told on yourself by deleting the messages. And sorry, dude. If you get suspended, I got no sympathy for you. I'm not going to cry crocodile tears for you. Well, I guess I could cry crocodile tears because crocodile tears are fake. So I'll pretend I'm sad. And I'll pull a you, Sherrone Moore. I'll do what you did after the Penn State game about how sad I am that you didn't get a chance to coach your first real game as head coach at Michigan if you get suspended. But I really won't care. Let's take a break. When we get back, we wrap up the show, one final segment with 4 down territory, including what artist name would you want? And this is timely because Ross Bjork talking about maybe selling the naming rights to Ohio Stadium. What artist's name would you want on Ohio Stadium if an artist bought the naming rights? We'll talk about it next. But first, here's a quick word from our sponsors. Welcome back in, Sons of the Shoe. Final segment as we go with a little fun thing we like to call 4 down territory to get us out of here. It's 4 topics. As we try to get out of here on a high, we get 4 opportunities here to talk about 4 different things. And I want to start with a topic that this might honestly be one of the best topics, not only that we've ever talked about on the show, but just ever. I mean, ever in college football. Like, who doesn't love a topic like this, which is Pitbull. I talked about it with Alec a little bit earlier in the show. Pitbull has bought the naming rights to FIU's football stadium. Now, this deal that he has comes with the following things. He pays $1.2 million per year for 5 years, according to the documents tied to the vote. The rapper, singer, businessman, whose name is Armando Christian Perez, nod to Miami. Okay. For me, I thought this had the details a little higher up in it. Okay, here we go. As part of the deal, according to the FIU board, Pitbull will create an anthem for FIU, post about the school on social media 12 times a year, and appear at one of the athletic fundraising events per year throughout the term of the agreement. Pitbull will get use of the stadium 10 days per year throughout the term of the deal, and the vodka company he owns will be the preferred brand distributed in the stadium. There's also perks like 2 reserved suites for all home football games. Now, this is, I think, a fascinating litmus test in the NIL era and the era where you're trying to raise money doing whatever and not having brand names on a stadium, but a person's name and an artist, a celebrity, their name goes on there. And then you tap into their resources and what they bring. This is awesome. I think this is a genius idea for a school like FIU. I mean, we've been spending all week talking about this topic. FIU's maybe never been talked about more in their lives, except for when they didn't make a run of the Final Four a couple years ago. So maybe then that's it. Or they made a deep run in March Madness, whenever it was. But this is they are on the map now because of this, and people are going to talk about it. But what I want to know from you guys at the 92 to the Fan YouTube channel, you can hit me up on X as well at @Spencito_, as you see at the bottom of the screen there. If you could have any artist name plastered on Ohio Stadium, any artist, who would it be? Because like the first of all, FIU missed an opportunity here because they could have done like Mr. Worldwide Stadium instead. Like that would have been funny. Just Mr. Worldwide, as people always says, whatever it could be. But I like the idea of the nickname on there instead. But regardless, I see he has ties to the Miami area, so it makes sense that he's on like a Florida school's stadium. That's why I kind of leaned into the idea that it has to be like a local, some sort of local group or celebrity, right? Like it has to be somebody who is notable in Ohio to really draw up the interest that you're looking for, right? So I don't know, like Rascal Flatts is from Columbus, but I feel like people are, I don't know, maybe not annoyed is the right word by Rascal Flatts, but I think people are like hit or miss on Rascal Flatts. Am I reading that correctly, or does everybody consensually love Rascal Flatts? I mean, here in Cleveland, where Nick and I are from, Kid Cudi's obviously a big deal. I think Kid Cudi on the stadium would be awesome. And he could basically have like a residency in Columbus and do shows there for over the course of 5 years. And I would love every second of that. I think that'd be cool. What else? Who else? I mean, obviously, if you could land like the big fish, which is Taylor Swift, that would be fantastic. If you could guarantee she does concerts in your stadium for 5 years, I mean, that's the economy you're looking for if you do if you do a venture like this, if you're Ohio State or some other school, because you know that she's going to bring in tons of money for you. And like, even if she's paying just a small amount to be, or, a couple million to be on the stadium's name, the economy boom that she just brings with you to the city that you're in is astronomical. Now, she doesn't need that. She is fine on her own. So it's more like a we need you more than you need us type thing. So maybe you let her put her name on the stadium for like $1. We just be like, hey, just to sign the paperwork, we're just going to make you pay $1. But yeah, we want you to come all the time and do shows, and we'll give you a suite. But she has no connections to Ohio State, so I doubt that's going to happen. And she's from Philly. So yeah, I'll say this: not an artist, but one of the names that makes the most sense to me would be LeBron. Like LeBron James on there. He's always had this affinity for Ohio State, had this affinity for Columbus. It seems fitting. They could make a deal with I'm sure they already have a deal with Nike, but his gear, his logo on all kinds of stuff. He could use the stadium for some of his events that he does, or things that he, business ventures he wants to explore, or maybe shoot movies there, whatever it could be. He could have a suite. It'd be the perfect setup. So I kind of like the idea of LeBron's name. But if you had to put any artist, on the name of Ohio Stadium, and this is, again, timely because Ross Bjork's talking about maybe selling naming rights to the stadium, who would it be? I'll also say this real quick. Dangerous territory. It's one thing to have like a company's name on your stadium, and that can be dicey too if the company dabbles in some questionable things. Like here in Cleveland, you have First Energy Stadium, was where the Browns used to play, and then First Energy got tied in with Governor DeWine and some people voting yes on some things, and helping get them out of some financial issues. And it didn't end up looking very good in the end. So then they took the name off the stadium. But I digress. But with people, it's even worse. People, there's like no barrier there's no barrier where you can kind of say or there's no degree of separation, right? You can't be like, well, we don't, subscribe to that company's values or what these people were doing. They just pay to have their name on the stadium. So we'll just take it all. With a person, it's like, nope, you're kind of invested in that person and letting them invest in you when they're showing up, doing concerts, all that. So it's an interesting game to play. It can be a risky thing, but I think it's still kind of a cool concept. So if you could pick any artist to have their name on Ohio Stadium, who would it be? I something about country artists are screaming out to me. I don't know why. There might be some good ones that would make sense. That would be cool. But again, I don't know that any of the big country artists are from Ohio. All right, we spent a lot of time on topic number 1. We go to topic number 2, which is Will Howard this week, throughout the week of practice, mentioned that he has slimmed down over 20 or about 20 pounds from what he weighed when he checked into camp. He was like 250 down to about 230 now. and what that, how Chip Kelly really kind of emphasized that as something that he should be trying to do. I think this is good news, especially as a quarterback. I mean, we're hearing in the NFL about Lamar Jackson slimming down and trying to be like quicker and more agile. This is what you want when you have a running quarterback. So to hear him say that, I thought was interesting, and I think it's a big deal and notable in terms of this offense, what he can do, how athletic he's going to be, and how athletic he's going to look. And so, yes, I liked hearing that, and I think it means good things for this offense moving forward into camp and the season. And yeah, like it's a slim down Will Howard is a good thing, I think, for Ohio State. Third down, we go to third down, and we'll stay with Will Howard at third down because he also had a pretty interesting quote when he was asked about what it's, just the difference between K-State and OSU. And his comments were basically that he doesn't feel like he has to be the guy. And I find that interesting because we all look to the quarterback and say, listen, in crunch time, it is up to the quarterback to make those plays. And that still is true. He can say that, but at the same time, like in 2 minutes to go in a game, driving down the field, you need to score. We're all going to look at Will Howard as the guy that's supposed to lead that. But that is alleviated when you have the talent that Ohio State has. You have a Quinshon Judkins lining up behind you or next to you. You have a Travion Henderson, same thing. You have Jeremiah Smith running downfield. He's going to make some great catches for you. You have Emeka Ibuka. Like, you have so many different options that it makes your life easier, and that pressure is kind of taken off, which is why it's so crazy that Kyle McCord was still as bad at times as he looked when he had all that talent around him, which is how we know he was bad. And then he still ended up coming up short in those moments because obviously more so of him because of himself than it was of anybody else. Because Marvin Harrison Jr. was brilliant for him this year, and others were great as well. But Will Howard, I think, has a chance to like really maximize that talent and equal, or maybe not equal all of them, because I don't think he's a CJ Stroud. I don't think he's that talent. But they're going to help him raise his game, and I think he already is coming in better than the previous quarterback they had. And that's a great starting point. And he's right in some capacity. Like, it still is going to be on you. I don't like that it's like, you don't have to be the guy. You still got to be the guy in some capacity because you got to get the ball to guys. You got to be composed. You got to lead these drives. But in the same vein, I get what he's saying because, yeah, like you have other guys around you who will meet you in the moment and help you get over that hump and get you to, help you earn the win that you're trying to win. Or that you're trying to get. So I think his point is pretty sound there, while also admitting or acknowledging that it still is always going to be on the quarterback, and that's how football works. And if he comes up short in those moments, he's going to be the first guy we're blaming, not necessarily Jeremiah Smith or Travion Henderson. Fourth down. Final one to get us out of here. The coaches poll released this week. And the rankings have Georgia as number 1, which I think makes a lot of sense. Ohio State, number 2. They got 7 first-place votes. Georgia got 46 first-place votes. So there you go. Oregon, number 3. Your other Big Ten teams in the top 10. Michigan is 8. The reigning champs. Penn State is 9. Maybe future Big Ten team, Florida State, is 10. But that rounds things out. The teams in the middle, Texas, Alabama, Ole Miss, and Notre Dame. I think this is fair. I don't know that anybody should read into the coaches poll that much. It's a preseason poll, and we know this stuff is going to change. But I'm okay with Ohio State being second to Georgia, and I think most of the rest of these teams make sense. I am curious. So, like, which of the Big Ten teams I just gave you in the top 10, Ohio State, Oregon, Michigan, Penn State, which one do you think has the chance to fall out of the top 10 faster? I think that's a pretty good question. And I honestly think the answer might be Michigan because week 2, they play Texas. And I know Texas is also in the top 10, but depending on what other teams are doing and other upsets that you might see play out there, I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up actually being Michigan. And I'm trying to check here real quick. Yeah, because Penn State, unless they lose to West Virginia week 1, their next 2 games are Bowling Green and Kent State. And they have a bye in the middle. I think they're going to be safe. But I think it's between those 2 teams in terms of the one that falls out of the top 10 first, but probably more so Michigan. And we're all waiting with bated breath to see if Michigan can, what Michigan's going to look like after winning the national championship and losing their entire roster to the NFL. I'm being Obviously, hyperbolic there. They didn't lose their entire roster, but we know they lost a lot of guys. Anywho, that's going to do it. Another episode of Sons of the Shoe in the books. I got to give a big shout out and a big thanks to Alec Dietz, new friend of the show who joined us in the first segment. And we appreciated all his insight into Oregon, the potential for this Ohio State-Oregon matchup to become a rivalry of the future in the Big Ten. And I thought he had some really good stuff to say. We'll connect with him during the season again, but I appreciate him jumping on with us this episode. And I appreciate you, as always, tuning in with us for Sons of the Shoe. Want to remind you one last time to like, follow, subscribe, comment to this podcast, on this podcast, wherever you get your podcast. The 92 Through the Fan YouTube channel is where you can do the commenting most notably, but also Spotify, Apple Podcasts, the Odyssey app, which we like to pump, obviously, being an Odyssey affiliate. And did I mention Apple Podcasts? I did mention Apple Podcasts, but I'm mentioning it again. Appreciate you guys as always. We'll be back next week with another episode and 1 week closer, mind you, to the start of the regular season in college football of Sons of the Shoe. Until then, take care. And as always, go Bucks.